Liberal democracy stands today like a grand cathedral whose walls are still intact, but whose altar lies in ruins. The stained glass glimmers, the rituals continue, and the congregation files in, but the divine presence it once gestured toward is gone. The edifice remains, yet it has lost its soul. The question is no longer whether this system is beautiful or efficient, but whether it is even real anymore. What animates it? What binds it? What does it believe? The promise of liberal democracy was seductive. Freedom without dogma, order without hierarchy, unity without tradition. It offered a neutral ground upon which differing visions of life could flourish in peace. In practice, however, this neutrality has proven to be a mask, thin and brittle. Beneath the surface lies a regime that believes in very little, yet enforces its unbelief with religious intensity. The modern democratic order has no answer to the ancient political question. What is the good life? It no longer even dares to ask it. Instead, it contents itself with managing conflict, arbitrating preferences, and regulating dissent. Its laws no longer pursue justice, but only procedure. Its politics is not a vision of the good, but a method of avoidance. Its freedom is not ordered toward excellence, but toward autonomy without purpose. And its citizens, having been told they are sovereign, find themselves increasingly governed by experts, algorithms, and bureaucracies. We are ruled not by tyrants, but by processes, processes that no one seems able to explain or control. Democracy has become a mechanical idol, demanding endless participation while delivering ever diminishing meaning. The vote, the debate, the public discourse, these continue with the hollow rhythm of a ritual long since evacuated of spirit. The people no longer govern, but they are told they do, and they are punished if they say otherwise. This essay will argue that the problem is not that liberal democracy has been betrayed or corrupted. The problem is that it was born without metaphysical foundations. It rejected any substantive account of the good, any binding vision of human nature, and any transcendent authority to which power must answer. It replaced all this with a mythology of progress, proceduralism, and the autonomous individual. But a house cannot stand if it refuses to admit the ground beneath it. A political order that denies the need for truth will soon find itself ruled by lies. What follows is not a nostalgic lament, nor a partisan diatribe. It is an indictment of first principles. Liberal democracy did not lose its way. It followed its logic to the end. It separated liberty from virtue, law from justice, power from purpose. And now, in its late stage, it is collapsing into contradiction. In place of tolerance, it demands conformity. In place of popular rule, it offers oligarchy. In place of limited government, it expands without restraint in every emergency. The liberal dream has become a technocratic nightmare. This is not merely a political failure, it is a spiritual one. A regime that denies the sacred will be ruled by the profane. A state that cannot name the good will become hostile to it. And the people who are taught that there is no truth will eventually be ruled by those who shout the loudest. In the pages that follow, we will examine the layers of this collapse. We will begin with the regime's loss of virtue and meaning, proceed through its abandonment of purpose and embrace of ideology, and expose its descent into oligarchy and elite betrayal. We will end with the leviathan that rises in every crisis, a monster born not of evil intentions, but of spiritual emptiness. The liberal order has reached its limits. What lies beyond it will not be another system of management, but a return to first principles, to truth, to order, to a vision of man not as consumer or a vote, but as a soul. Part 1. A regime without a soul. The modern political order presents itself as pragmatic, flexible, and enlightened, proudly unencumbered by metaphysical dogma. It claims no allegiance to particular visions of the good life, no grand teleology, no unifying ideal beyond the sacredness of autonomy. But a regime cannot remain coherent, much less just, without a soul. Politics, after all, is not simply the management of power. It is the organization of life according to what is true and what is good. When a political system rejects both, it does not become free, it becomes weightless. And that weightlessness is not liberation, it is disintegration. At the heart of this disintegration is a profound confusion about liberty. Modern man, trained to believe that freedom means the absence of restraint, has forgotten that liberty is a moral concept, not a mechanical one. It is not simply the capacity to choose anything, but the capacity to choose well. Freedom without orientation, without purpose, without limits rooted in the nature of things, is not freedom. It is chaos. When all constraints are seen as threats, even those that order us toward excellence, then liberty devours itself. A society cannot endure long in that state. What begins as liberation ends in anarchy or tyranny, and often both. The liberal ideal of a value neutral public sphere rests on the illusion that political life can be separated from moral and metaphysical commitments. But every law, every policy, every right, protected or denied, reflects some conception of the good. Neutrality is not merely unsustainable, it is dishonest. No society can legislate, educate, or govern without answering fundamental questions about human nature, the purpose of life, and the meaning of justice. A regime that refuses to answer them openly will do so secretly through the machinery of bureaucracy, judicial activism, or corporate coercion. In place of a substantive moral vision, liberal democracy offers procedure. When confronted with moral dilemmas, it retreats into rules and regulations. When asked to define justice, it provides due process. When questioned about the purpose of society, it invokes pluralism. But proceduralism is not a substitute for principle. It is, at best, a mechanism for applying principles already agreed upon. If those principles no longer exist, if there is no shared understanding of the good, then procedure becomes a shell. It can no longer mediate conflict, it can only disguise it. This void invites technocracy. In the absence of moral wisdom, governance is handed over to experts, data analysts, legal technicians, and corporate managers. They do not rule according to justice or virtue, but according to efficiency, metrics, and compliance. The citizen becomes a subject of systems, not a participant in a moral order. The state, once conceived as a guardian of the common good, becomes a neutral referee, until, of course, neutrality must be abandoned to impose the new orthodoxy. For even in its self declared neutrality, liberal democracy cannot escape its own need for dogma. When it suppresses theological authority, it does not become secular in the true sense. It becomes dogmatic about its own procedures, its own myths, its own taboos. It creates sacred truths, not by elevating the eternal, but by rendering certain concepts untouchable: autonomy, equality, progress. These replace traditional ideals of virtue, justice, and truth. And because they cannot be questioned, they are enforced with ever growing zeal. The result is a regime that appears open but behaves as if threatened by every dissenting word. Public discourse narrows, not by law alone, but through cultural enforcement. Educational institutions no longer form minds, they condition them. Media no longer seeks truth, it polices deviation. And politics itself becomes theater, in which the range of acceptable opinion is defined in advance, and opposition is choreographed into irrelevance. Underneath it all, there is a terrible silence. Ask the liberal regime what it is for, what end it serves, what human beings are for, what society is meant to produce, and it cannot answer. It may offer slogans: growth, freedom, inclusion. But press further, and the slogans collapse into preferences, and the preferences into nothing at all. There is no telos, no essence, no higher good beyond the constant churning of choice itself. The regime cannot inspire because it cannot aspire. What remains then is management. A managed people, a managed economy, a managed morality. Not a political community in any real sense, but a collection of individuals governed by rules they did not write, in service to goods they do not share, under elites they did not choose, according to a logic they cannot question. This is not decadence in the aesthetic sense, but in the spiritual one. The loss of moral imagination, the fatigue of metaphysical effort, the willingness to live without purpose. This emptiness cannot hold. A regime that refuses to name the good will eventually serve something else: power, pleasure, control, ideology. The vacuum will be filled, and when it is, the illusion of freedom will vanish. In its place will rise something that looks familiar: courts, elections, parliaments, but behaves very differently. It will no longer tolerate difference, because it no longer believes in truth. It will no longer protect liberty, because it no longer understands what liberty is for. This is the first sign of collapse: a political order that governs without knowing why. What follows is predictable. In the absence of virtue, the people turn to novelty. In the absence of purpose, the elite turn to ideology. And in the absence of truth, the state turns to force. Let us now turn to the next phase in this collapse: the abandonment of purpose and the suicidal logic that follows from it. Part 2: Telos abandoned. A civilization is not sustained by comfort, nor by law, nor even by liberty in the abstract. It is sustained by a shared belief in what life is for. When that belief dies, the society dies, first spiritually, then institutionally, and finally biologically. The modern democratic world is in precisely that phase. It has abandoned not only the good, but even the idea that there is such a thing. It has renounced final ends, metaphysical order, and inherited purpose. The liberal order did not just forget its telos, it rejected it on principle. From its earliest breath, the liberal project claimed to free man from the burdens of tradition and transcendence. What it gave him instead was the burden of self creation. He would no longer receive his identity, his obligations, or his destiny from above. He would construct them from within. He would be autonomous, sovereign, unbound. But man cannot live this way. He is not a god. And when he tries to act like one, he ends up less than a man. The very freedom he thought would elevate him dissolves his purpose, and with it, his reason to endure. This loss is not simply moral, it is metaphysical. The liberal order taught the modern man that he is a blank slate, a bundle of desires with no given nature. This was sold as progress, as liberation from the oppressive constraints of religion, family, and inherited duty. But it was, in truth, the severing of man from his roots, from the cosmic order that once made sense of his suffering and nobility alike. Without telos, man becomes weightless, drifting from pleasure to pleasure, novelty to novelty, until even the pleasures lose their savor and only distraction remains. Freedom, once a virtue exercised in pursuit of what is highest, becomes mere permission. You may do what you like, says the modern world, as long as you harm no one. But this formulation, so often repeated, hides a profound lie. To harm no one is not a definition of good. It is the abdication of the very question. Worse, it implies that all goods are merely private, that nothing shared, nothing binding, nothing transcendent can be known or protected. Society becomes a market of appetites, not a community of souls. In this environment, even reason falters. Reason was once understood as man's capacity to know truth, to discern form and end, to deliberate about what is just and unjust. But in a liberal order without metaphysical grounding, reason is reduced to utility, to calculation, to the efficient pursuit of preference. What cannot be measured or monetized is dismissed as irrational. Poetry, virtue, sacrifice. These are tolerated at best and pathologized at worst. The consequences are everywhere. Modern education no longer forms citizens, it conditions laborers and consumers. Modern politics no longer pursues justice, it arbitrates grievances. Even modern religion, where it survives, often mimics the therapeutic language of the surrounding culture, offering comfort without repentance, affirmation without transformation. The sacred is replaced by the sentimental, the eternal by the immediate. As the liberal regime matures, its contradictions become unbearable. It tells the citizen he is sovereign, but forbids him from believing in anything that would make his sovereignty meaningful. It urges the individual to be free, but strips from him every institution that might teach him how to use that freedom well. It celebrates rights, but cannot explain their origin. It promises progress, but marches ever deeper into spiritual exhaustion. And then, inevitably, comes the substitute. When telos is lost, ideology takes its place. A politics without purpose becomes a politics of grievance. A society without higher ends finds its unity not in a shared good, but in a shared enemy. This is the point at which liberalism, having emptied itself of purpose, begins to mutate. It becomes not a regime of tolerance, but a cult of progress. It weaponizes its neutrality. It begins to enforce a new orthodoxy, not by appeal to truth, but by the raw moralism of the moment. Thus, the suicidal logic completes itself. Liberal democracy kills its own metaphysical foundations and then punishes anyone who notices the corpse. It turns freedom into nihilism and then turns nihilism into ideology. It cannot return to purpose because purpose requires truth, and truth threatens the regime. What began as emancipation becomes surveillance. What began as pluralism becomes censorship. What began as self government becomes algorithmic manipulation. The future it promised turns out to be a void, and into that void rush the darker forces of man: resentment, envy, fear, and the lust for power disguised as compassion. This is not the exception, it is the trajectory. Once telos is rejected, nothing else can hold. The next stage is not collapse, it is control. Let us now follow that trajectory to its next form: the emergence of ideological coercion in the name of tolerance. What liberalism could not build, it now seeks to police. Part 3: The Rise of Ideological Coercion. It is one of the strangest paradoxes of our age that the societies which speak most loudly of openness, tolerance, and diversity are often those most ruthlessly committed to conformity. The liberal regime, having severed itself from transcendent truths, finds itself adrift, and adrift regimes do not tolerate dissent. Once freedom has been reduced to autonomy and neutrality becomes a fiction, what remains is control. A new orthodoxy emerges, not rooted in the eternal or the rational, but in the sentiments and slogans of the moment, and woe to the man who stands in its way. In the beginning, liberalism promised pluralism. It claimed it would make space for 1,000 flowers to bloom, each individual free to pursue his conception of the good, unimpeded by the state or by dogma. But pluralism without truth cannot endure. When a society refuses to affirm the good, it becomes haunted by the need to suppress those who do. In practice, the regime of tolerance becomes a regime of enforced relativism, where every opinion is permitted except those that appeal to something higher than consent. At first, this coercion is subtle. It begins in the language. Words are policed, not by law, but by custom and corporate fiat. Concepts such as virtue, order, or nature are gradually recoded as oppressive. Speech becomes dangerous. Silence becomes suspect. The very tools of liberal discourse, debate, persuasion, argument, are treated as threats because they imply the existence of truth. And truth, in a world built on preference, is intolerable. Soon, the boundaries tighten. Dissent becomes deviance. The citizen who dares to question the moral direction of the regime is told he is hateful, uneducated, or mentally unwell. His objections are not refuted, they are diagnosed. He is excluded not because he is wrong, but because he is no longer one of us. The mechanisms of exclusion are quiet but effective: deplatforming, demotion, social ostracism, and digital erasure. The state need not intervene. The culture has already done its work. All of this happens, of course, in the name of freedom, but it is a freedom that cannot bear disagreement. Liberalism has become a political order that preaches diversity but enforces homogeneity, that exalts individual expression while demanding moral uniformity. It has become what it once claimed to oppose: a regime of dogma in which heresy is punished and piety rewarded, not to God nor to country, but to an amorphous ideology of progress. This is not simply hypocrisy, it is inevitability. When a society loses its metaphysical moorings, it does not become neutral. It becomes ideological. And because it cannot appeal to permanent truths, it must justify itself through constant motion. The regime must be always changing, always evolving, always redefining its ideals so that none can ever rest or question. The citizen is kept in a state of permanent moral mobilization, constantly repenting yesterday's orthodoxy in the name of today's enlightenment. The result is exhaustion. The average man, though told he is freer than any human in history, finds himself afraid to speak his mind, uncertain about what his children will be taught, wary of his colleagues and neighbors. He lives under a tyranny of moods, a politics driven not by reason or tradition, but by the ever shifting dictates of cultural elites who mistake novelty for justice and coercion for compassion. Yet, even as liberalism demands uniformity, it denies that it is doing so. It hides its ideology beneath the language of inclusion and equity. It claims to be merely protecting the vulnerable or preventing harm. But behind this moralistic theater lies raw power: the power to define reality and to punish deviation from it. And because this power is exercised without acknowledgement of its metaphysical nature, it is more dangerous than any traditional authority. It does not recognize itself as a religion, yet it behaves like one, complete with saints, sinners, blasphemies, and inquisitions. There is no genuine tolerance here. There is only submission, submission to a political theology that denies it is one. This is the end stage of a politics that began by renouncing truth. Without truth, there can be no genuine freedom, and without freedom, there can be no tolerance. There can only be obedience. The liberal regime has, in effect, become a parody of what it once claimed to oppose. In place of the old moral order, it has installed a new one, more fluid, more abstract, but no less totalizing. And because it lacks grounding in anything permanent, it must be enforced with relentless vigilance. The citizen must be re educated, the child must be reconditioned, the past must be rewritten, and the future must belong not to truth, but to whatever direction the prevailing mood commands. This is not a glitch in the liberal project, it is its logical outcome. A system that denies the good must eventually redefine it, and when persuasion fails, it will turn to coercion. That coercion will be administered not by tyrants, but by technocrats, those who claim to have no ideology, no agenda, only data, science, and expertise. Which brings us to the next layer of the collapse: the reality behind the democratic mask. Let us now examine how this ideological conformity functions within a deeper structure, one not of mass rule, but of elite domination. For beneath the slogans and ballots lies something older, colder, and far more permanent. Part 4: The oligarchic core of democratic form. Beneath every political form lies a political reality. And the reality behind the democratic form is this: the people do not rule, they are ruled. The sovereignty of the masses is a noble fiction. a myth sustained by ritual voting, symbolic debate, and the illusion of choice. But in truth, modern democracy is not the rule of the many. It is the rule of the few, under the name of the many. It is oligarchy in democratic dress. This is not a recent betrayal. It is not the result of corruption or decline. It is structural. Every society, no matter how it is constituted, is governed by elites. The only real question is what kind of elites and by what principles they rule. Democratic regimes pretend to dissolve this structure by dispersing power through elections and representative bodies. But these mechanisms do not eliminate elite rule, they merely obscure it. They replace visible authority with invisible control. The modern liberal state is governed by a professional class: managers, consultants, financiers, media figures, academics, and bureaucrats who circulate through institutions that were never designed to be democratic. These elites are not accountable in any meaningful sense. They do not rise from the people, nor do they answer to them. They are trained, credentialed, and installed through networks of influence that operate above the reach of public opinion. Elections may change the faces, but never the system. The structure remains intact. This is the first and greatest lie of liberal democracy, that power belongs to the people. In reality, power belongs to those who shape the narrative, control the institutions, and manage the levers of enforcement. The people are permitted to choose between options pre-selected for their acceptability. They may register discontent, but only within defined boundaries. They may vote out politicians, but never touch the deeper machinery of policy and ideology. Modern politics, then, is a spectacle, a carefully managed performance in which opposition is controlled and dissent is domesticated. The parties may differ in rhetoric, but rarely in substance. The bureaucracy continues, the judiciary interprets, the media spins, and the universities indoctrinate. The ruling class adapts, reshuffles, and absorbs every challenge. Even populist uprisings are quickly neutered or redirected. The regime survives because it is not located in a single office or figure. It is dispersed, systemic, and self replicating. This elite class, though diverse in appearance, shares a common worldview. It is not bound by nation, tradition, or religion. It is defined by mobility, abstraction, and technocratic authority. Its legitimacy does not rest on virtue or public service, but on claims to expertise. It does not speak the language of the people, but of management. It governs not by inspiration, but by administration. To mask this reality, the regime invests heavily in democratic symbolism. Public discourse is flooded with appeals to equality, participation, and rights. But the language is hollow. The institutions that matter are insulated from public influence. Central banks, intelligence agencies, transnational courts, regulatory bodies, these are not subject to the ballot. They are governed by a logic of self preservation and elite consensus. This is not freedom, it is control by other means. And the people, sensing the lie but unable to articulate it, retreat into cynicism or spectacle. They are told they are sovereign, yet nothing they vote for seems to change the trajectory. They are told they are free, yet they live under the surveillance of governments and corporations that monitor their words, their purchases, their thoughts. They are told they are heard, yet their most pressing concerns are dismissed as populism, bigotry, or ignorance. The tragedy is that many still cling to the form, believing it can be saved. But forms without content are masks, and masks do not protect, they deceive. The true regime does not meet in parliaments. It meets in boardrooms, foundation retreats, intelligence briefings, and editorial conferences. Its members are not elected, but selected. Its loyalty is not to the nation, but to a global order that promises stability, profit, and ideological control. This is not a call for nostalgia. The older forms of elite rule were more honest. and, in many cases, more just. At least the king was known. At least the aristocracy bore duties as well as privileges. At least authority was grounded in something beyond utility and sentiment. The modern oligarchy has no such burden. It rules through networks, not altars, through algorithms, not anointed hands. It is everywhere and nowhere, accountable to no one, and loyal to nothing. To speak of democracy in this context is to perpetuate a myth. The reality is oligarchy, a closed system of rule by those who control knowledge, capital, and access. And this rule is not neutral, it is ideological. The elite not only manage institutions, they manage meaning. They define what is acceptable, what is offensive, what is science, what is hate, what is news, what is truth. And they do so while proclaiming their neutrality, their objectivity, their commitment to fairness. The liberal democratic regime has perfected the art of masking power. It does not crush opposition, it absorbs it. It does not silence criticism, it manages it. It does not forbid religion, it replaces it. And it does all this while insisting that the people still rule. But the people do not rule, they are ruled. And the ruling class, once secure in its disguise, is now growing bolder. It no longer merely hides, it now punishes. Let us turn next to the betrayal of that very people whose sovereignty was once the regime's foundational myth. We will examine how the elites have not only seized power, but abandoned their duties, their loyalties, and even the pretense of serving the common good. Part 5. Elites without honor, nations without guardians. No political order can survive when its elites abandon the people. The rulers of any regime, whether king, senate, clergy, or council, must in some way be bound to those they govern, not merely by law or force, but by loyalty. When that bond breaks, when those in power no longer see themselves as stewards of a common good, but as managers of a population, the regime enters its twilight. This is where the liberal world now stands, governed by elites who have ceased to lead and now merely preside, who no longer protect but extract, who do not represent the people but rule in spite of them. The modern ruling class is not aristocratic in the traditional sense. It lacks rootedness, character, and a sense of noblesse oblige. It does not inherit authority with the weight of duty. It acquires power through institutions that reward ambition, conformity, and ideological mimicry. Its loyalty is not to the land, the family, or the sacred, but to networks, markets, and abstractions. It lives in a world of airports, conferences, gated compounds, and managed narratives. It speaks in jargon, governs by spreadsheet, and despises the very populations it claims to represent. This class has constructed a system that allows it to float above the burdens it imposes, while demanding that ordinary citizens sacrifice, adapt, and obey. It evades responsibility through the labyrinth of bureaucracy, the opacity of policy, and the diffusion of blame. It frames its rule as enlightened, its critics as dangerous, and its failures as the fault of the governed. The political class, the corporate elite, the cultural arbiters, all draw from the same well of disconnection. They do not see the people, they see a problem to be managed. Nowhere is this clearer than in the rise of technocracy. The modern elite justifies its rule not by appeal to virtue or tradition, but to expertise. It no longer claims to serve the people's moral good, but to administer their needs. This is not government, it is management. The citizen becomes a client, the state becomes a service provider, and politics itself is reduced to policy execution, monitored by algorithms and enforced through soft coercion. But this mode of rule is fundamentally dishonest. Expertise is not neutral. It is wielded in the service of ideological goals, disguised as objective necessity. The language of science, data, and security becomes the new gospel, unquestionable, infallible, and always expanding its jurisdiction. Dissent is not debated, it is pathologized. The people are not persuaded, they are nudged, surveilled, or ignored. This betrayal has been long in the making. It began when the liberal order elevated process over substance, and it matured when it elevated administration over statesmanship. The result is a class of rulers who do not know the governed, who do not live among them, and who do not share their aspirations. They celebrate globalism while hollowing out nations. They champion diversity while insulating themselves from its consequences. They praise democracy while circumventing its results. And when the people rebel, when they vote against treaties, reject the wisdom of experts, or elect those who defy the script, the reaction is not introspection, it is punishment. The people are labeled backward, racist, fascist, deplorable. Their communities are ridiculed, their traditions vilified, their concerns dismissed as phobias. The rulers, having declared themselves guardians of democracy, now act as its gatekeepers. Elections may still occur, but their outcomes are provisional, acceptable only when they affirm the ruling consensus. This is the moment where betrayal becomes open. The elites no longer hide their contempt for the governed. They speak of populism as a disease. They conspire, publicly or quietly, to override decisions made by citizens. In courts, in treaties, in editorial rooms, they move swiftly to undo what the ballot box dared to deliver. The will of the people becomes a problem to be solved, not a mandate to be respected. Such regimes cannot endure. When the bond between ruler and ruled is broken, what remains is domination, not order. And domination, once exposed, must escalate. The elites, now unmoored from any duty beyond their own preservation, retreat further into fortresses of bureaucracy, corporate enforcement, and ideological absolutism. They grow more shrill, more punitive, more desperate in their need to control what they no longer understand. This is not governance, it is abandonment. The state no longer embodies a nation. The culture no longer reflects a people. The laws no longer guard a heritage. Everything becomes plastic, flexible, up for reinterpretation by those whose only loyalty is to the system that sustains them. A civilization governed by such a class is not long for this world. And yet, even as their legitimacy crumbles, the elite retain one final tool: the pretext of crisis. In times of emergency, power is rarely questioned, and our elites have learned well. If no crisis exists, one can always be manufactured, or prolonged, or declared permanent. It is to this strategy, the politics of emergency, the regime of the permanent exception, that we now turn. Part 6: Liberalism's Final Mechanism of Control. A political order without roots must constantly justify itself. It cannot appeal to tradition, truth, or natural authority, so it turns to fear. It manufactures urgency, exploits emergency, and thrives in the atmosphere of permanent instability. For a liberal regime in decline, the crisis is not an obstacle, it's a gift. It allows what would otherwise be unacceptable. It suspends scrutiny. It silences dissent. It centralizes power while claiming to save the people from danger. And it never, ever gives that power back. This is the final stage of liberalism's transformation, from a regime of freedom to a regime of control, legitimized not by consent, but by perpetual catastrophe. It declares the exception and makes it the rule. The tools of emergency become the tools of ordinary governance. What was once temporary becomes permanent. The war, the pandemic, the climate, the economy. There is always a reason why liberty must be deferred, why debate must be muted, why unity must be enforced from above. This is no accident. The liberal state, having lost its telos and betrayed its people, finds itself unable to govern by principle. It must now govern by momentum, by spectacle, by panic. And so it learns to manufacture emergencies, or at the very least, to stretch them indefinitely. Every crisis becomes a justification for expansion. Every expansion becomes a precedent. Each step deeper into the labyrinth of centralization is taken reluctantly, so they say, but never reversed. Power, once seized, is rarely relinquished. Bureaucracies that arise during emergencies do not disappear when the danger passes. Surveillance systems do not vanish. Special legal powers are not retired. Whole new languages are created of security, threat, urgency, used to reshape the relationship between state and citizen. And the people, afraid, bewildered, exhausted, accept what they would never have tolerated in calmer times. They become subjects, not in law, but in spirit. But the most dangerous feature of this transformation is that it hides behind the old words. Elections continue, courts operate, newspapers print, yet everything has changed. The state has become a leviathan with a liberal face. It no longer restrains itself because it no longer believes in limits. Its only telos now is its own preservation, its only moral compass, the logic of emergency. And so it expands, always. Every aspect of life becomes politicized because every aspect becomes a potential crisis. Public health, misinformation, climate, equity, each becomes a battlefield in which the regime can declare exceptional authority. And once declared, the new powers are normalized, institutionalized, moralized. Opposition becomes not merely political, but pathological. To dissent is to endanger lives. To question is to deny science. To resist is to threaten democracy itself. Thus, liberalism, which once promised to protect the private from the political, ends by absorbing everything into politics, and not politics in the noble sense, but in the manipulative, technocratic, and managerial sense. The private is no longer sacred. The home is regulated. The family is redefined. The conscience is policed. The body itself becomes an object of political control. And through it all, the language of freedom is retained. Indeed, it is weaponized. Citizens are told they are free precisely when they are most monitored. They are assured of their sovereignty even as they are locked into systems of tracking, surveillance, and algorithmic nudging. The citizen's role is no longer to deliberate and act, but to comply and affirm. His freedom consists in choosing between options curated for him by powers he does not see and cannot remove. The crisis regime does not require belief, it requires exhaustion. It does not inspire, it overwhelms. It does not argue, it asserts. And in doing so, it creates a new kind of citizen, passive, anxious, and fragmented. This citizen has been trained not to expect stability, but to endure chaos. He has learned that nothing is sacred, that everything is negotiable, that he must adapt or be excluded. He is not liberated, he is pacified. This is the culmination of liberalism's long arc, from a promise of freedom to a system of surveillance, from pluralism to ideological conformity, from popular rule to elite manipulation, and finally, from governance to emergency. It is the end of politics as a deliberation about the good, and the triumph of politics as the administration of crisis. But there is one final truth the regime cannot escape. No order can endure on fear alone. The politics of panic is unstable. The people may be fooled for a time, they may be silenced for a season, but a regime that governs by emergency eventually loses all legitimacy. It can coerce, but it cannot command. It can manage, but it cannot inspire. And when the next crisis comes, real or imagined, it may find that no one believes it anymore. The liberal order has reached this point. Its tools are exhausted. Its myths are threadbare. Its soul is gone. What remains is a shell, animated by fear, driven by momentum, and haunted by the very truth it tried to forget, that man cannot live without a purpose, and that power without justice is not order, but tyranny. We now stand at the edge. The hollow center can no longer hold. The only question that remains is whether a new order can rise, one not built on management and moods, but on truth, authority, and the common good. Liberal democracy promised a new age. It offered freedom without virtue, unity without tradition, prosperity without sacrifice, and order without hierarchy. It cast off the old world, the throne, the altar, the family, the creed, and declared the individual sovereign. Its architects believed they were building a system that would transcend the bloodshed and fanaticism of the past, but in reality, they were building on air. What began as an ideal of self government became a regime of self negation. In seeking to free man from external constraints, it severed him from internal purpose. In promising neutrality, it denied the need for truth. In substituting process for substance, it built a state incapable of judgment, leadership, or love. It tried to create a society without metaphysics and ended with a population without meaning. Liberalism's failure is not political in the narrow sense, it is metaphysical. It has produced a civilization that cannot say what man is, what freedom is for, what law ought to serve, or why anything matters at all. Its vocabulary is exhausted, its institutions are brittle, and its elite are estranged. It governs not by vision, but by reflex, not through reverence, but through force disguised as consent. The path was always there, latent in its founding logic. A regime that detaches liberty from truth will turn liberty into license. A society that exalts choice above all else will eventually sacrifice everything: family, virtue, history, even reality itself, on the altar of preference. And when choice becomes incoherent, power fills the void, the state becomes Leviathan, the expert becomes king, the dissident becomes criminal. We now live in the shadow of that collapse. The liberal regime, still wrapped in the rhetoric of human rights and democracy, now resembles the very despotisms it once claimed to oppose. It censors, surveils, indoctrinates, and punishes. Not openly, not always with jackboots or gulags, but with the quiet ruthlessness of bureaucracies, networks, and consensus. It has created a world where nothing is sacred, where history is fluid, where man is malleable, and where freedom is nothing more than submission to the correct opinions. And yet, something stirs. The mask is slipping. The people are restless. The rituals no longer enchant. The contradictions can no longer be ignored. There is an unspoken awareness. Among ordinary men and women, among thinkers and faithful, among the young who feel the emptiness, and the old who remember what was lost, that this cannot go on. The question now is not how to save the liberal order. It cannot be saved. The question is what will come next. And here lies our task: not to propose a new ideology, but to return to old truths, to rebuild on rock, not on sand, to re anchor law in the moral order, authority in virtue, freedom in purpose, and society in the sacred, to restore hierarchy where chaos reigns, to cultivate beauty where ugliness spreads, and to speak truth where silence is enforced. This is not a call for nostalgia, it is a call for renewal. Not the renewal of an ideology, but of civilization, not through reactionary rage, nor progressive abstraction, but through the recovery of what was never truly outdated. That man is more than a will, society more than a contract, and truth more than a consensus. Liberalism has hollowed out the center. If we do not fill it with something higher, something ordered and enduring, then something lower will take its place. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. We must choose: either return to the eternal, or be ruled by the transient; either rebuild on truth, or be ruled by lies; either restore the soul, or be consumed by the machine. The hollow center cannot hold. Let us begin again, with courage, with reverence, and with the knowledge that to speak of the good to defend the true, and to seek the just is not dangerous. It is the only way a civilization can survive.